All of these 15 women have something in common. They're mass murderers and faced the death penalty. In this video, we delve into their last words, many of which will give you goosebumps. Evelyn Harper, State of Texas, 1984. Evelyn Harper endured years of torment in a violent marriage. Her husband, Richard Harper, was known for his explosive temper and frequent physical abuse. The bruises, the fractured ribs, the endless nights of fear, it had become an inescapable cycle. After countless failed attempts to seek help, fearing for her life, Evelyn made a desperate decision. She laced his dinner with a lethal dose of poison. She watched him eat, trembling, uncertain whether she was sealing her own fate. Initially, authorities suspected natural causes, but an autopsy revealed traces of the deadly substance in his system. The investigation led straight to Evelyn, who was arrested. During the trial, her defense team argued that she acted in self-defense, that she had no escape from the violence that consumed her home. However, the court ruled it was premeditated murder, sentencing her to death in 1984. On death row, Evelyn spent 11 years reflecting on her choices, writing letters to domestic violence survivors, hoping her story would serve as a cautionary tale. Her once timid nature hardened behind bars, but deep down she longed for a different ending. Her final request was a plate of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and sweet tea, a meal reminiscent of her childhood in the countryside. Just before her execution in 1995, she expressed remorse but maintained that she saw no other way out of her suffering. The needle entered her vein, and within minutes, Evelyn Harper's name became another entry in the records of the executed. Linda Carson, State of Florida, 1992. Linda Carson had once been a respected businesswoman, a figure of ambition and power in the corporate world. But when financial disaster loomed over her company, desperation led her down a dark path. She and her business partner Peter Lawson had built an empire together, but cracks began to form when the company faced impending bankruptcy. Lawson wanted to cut his losses, but Linda saw him as an obstacle in her way. She decided to eliminate him. Hiring a hitman was not an impulsive act. It was calculated, methodical. She ensured her involvement remained concealed, using an intermediary to contact the killer. The crime was executed flawlessly, or so she thought. A forensic accountant uncovered discrepancies in financial transactions, linking Linda to the murder. Investigators traced her phone records, unearthing damning evidence. She was arrested in 1992, and despite her insistence that she had been coerced into the plot, the jury found her guilty of first-degree murder. Sentenced to death in 1994, she spent 7 years on death row, where she became deeply religious, though some believed her faith was nothing more than an attempt to seek sympathy. She was known to keep a Bible in her cell, underlining verses about redemption and judgment. Her last meal was a simple Caesar salad and black coffee. Before her execution in 2001, she left a written statement apologizing for her actions, though speculation remained. Was she truly remorseful, or was this yet another calculated move from a woman who had mastered the art of deception? Deborah Mills, State of California, 1987. Deborah Mills had once believed in love. She had envisioned a life of happiness with her fiancé, building a home together, creating memories. But all of that shattered the day she discovered his affair. The betrayal festered inside her, an infection that spread through every thought, every breath. She obsessed over his deception, consumed by visions of revenge. One evening, she prepared his favorite cocktail, laced with poison. She watched him take each sip, her heartbeat steady. Hours later, he was found unconscious, and though she called emergency services, her performance as a grieving fiancé was flawed. Forensic evidence revealed the presence of a rare toxin in his system, leading investigators straight to her. The case unraveled piece by piece as prosecutors painted a picture of a woman so consumed by anger that she planned his death in cold blood. Her trial was highly publicized, with debates on whether her actions were driven by temporary insanity or pure malice. Psychological evaluations suggested a history of emotional instability, but the courts rejected these claims, and her sentence was upheld. As her execution date approached in 1996, she requested steak and red wine for her last meal. Her final words were whispered prayers, seeking redemption for what she had done. Some witnesses believed she died with regret. Others believed she had found peace in knowing that her former lover could never betray her again. Melissa Grayson, State of Texas, 1990. Melissa Grayson had always been passionate, sometimes too passionate. When she loved fiercely. When she hated, she did so with the same intensity. And when she lost, she couldn't let go. Her marriage had crumbled long before the divorce papers were signed, but she still believed that time would bring them back together. She convinced herself it was just a phase, that he would come home one day full of regret, asking for another chance. But he didn't. Instead, he moved on. Quickly. Too quickly. When Melissa found out he was getting remarried, something inside her snapped. How could he replace her so easily? Hadn't they shared years of love, pain, and sacrifice? She refused to be discarded like yesterday's news. If he wanted a new life, she would make sure it ended before it could begin. She planned everything, drove to his house late at night, brought the gun she had bought 2 months earlier just in case. She knocked on the door, feigning calm, rehearsing what she would say. When he opened it, his fiancée by his side, all the practiced words disappeared. The rage hit like a storm. Accusations flew. He tried to close the door, but she pushed through, and then, in a moment of blind fury, she pulled the trigger. Once, twice. She didn't stop until they were both on the floor. The neighbors heard the gunshots. By the time the police arrived, Melissa was standing over the bodies, hands shaking, breath ragged. Her attorneys argued dissociation, emotional distress, a psychological break, but the prosecution had a simpler explanation: revenge. The jury believed it. Convicted in 1990, Melissa spent 7 years on death row. In prison, she wrote letters to her ex-husband's children, expressing regret, asking for forgiveness. They never responded. Her last meal was a blueberry muffin and green tea. Simple, almost poetic in its irony. As she lay strapped to the execution table in 1997, she whispered her final apology. But by then, the world had long since stopped listening. Rebecca Sloan, State of Arkansas, 1998. Rebecca Sloan had always felt like an outsider in her own family. She wasn't the daughter her parents wanted. She was the one they were stuck with. Growing up, she was always the afterthought, the unwanted stepchild. Her mother and stepfather had their own plans, their own goals, and Rebecca was just an obstacle. She resented them, their cold indifference, the way they brushed her aside like an inconvenience. Then she found out about the will. Her stepfather had promised her financial security, a small token for years of neglect. But when she saw the updated documents, she realized she had been all but erased. The money, the house, it was all going to someone else. In that moment, she understood the truth. They had never cared. They had never planned to give her anything. That night, she decided to take what she was owed. She staged the break-in carefully, making sure to leave the front door slightly ajar. She wore gloves, moved quickly, left drawers open and valuables scattered. But her true goal wasn't theft. It was justice. She found them asleep in their bed. The gun felt heavier in her hands than she expected, but when she pulled the trigger, the weight lifted. For a few days, she thought she had gotten away with it. The police believed it was a home invasion gone wrong. But then came the security footage. A neighbor's camera had caught her entering the house hours before the attack. It was enough to bring the whole case crashing down on her. At trial, she showed no remorse. Why should she? In her eyes, they had stolen her future. She had simply taken it back. Unlike most inmates, she refused a last meal. "I don't deserve it," she had told the guards. Some thought it was an act of defiance. Others believed it was the first and only moment of guilt she had ever shown. On the night of her execution in 2003, she stared at the ceiling as the lethal injection took effect. She didn't fight, didn't speak, didn't beg. Her final moments were as silent as the years she had spent feeling invisible. Natalie Evans, State of Oklahoma, 2002. Natalie Evans and her brother Thomas had never been close. Their relationship had always been tainted by competition, jealousy, and unresolved resentment. Even as children, their parents had unknowingly fed the fire, always comparing them, always expecting more. Thomas was the golden child. The responsible one, the ambitious one, the one who could do no wrong. Natalie was the afterthought, the one who was always just a little too reckless, Their rivalry followed them into adulthood, becoming a quiet, simmering resentment. But when their parents passed, leaving behind a sizable inheritance, the tension exploded into something much darker. The will was clear. Thomas would receive the house and the majority of their parents' assets, while Natalie was left with a fraction of what she had expected. She was furious. She demanded explanations, accused him of manipulating their parents in their final years. He dismissed her anger, told her she was being childish. "You never took responsibility for anything," he had said, his voice flat, indifferent. "Maybe this will finally teach you." That was the moment everything changed. She spent weeks stewing in her anger, replaying their conversation over and over again. He had taken everything. He had taken their parents' love, their approval, their legacy, and now he had taken the last thing she had left, her future. One evening she drove to his house, shaking with rage. At first she told herself it would just be a confrontation. She would make him understand. She would make him see. But Thomas didn't listen. He laughed at her, mocked her, told her to get over it. And then she snapped. The knife was in her pocket, but she didn't remember grabbing it. She didn't remember the first strike or the second, but when the red started spreading across his shirt, she knew there was no turning back. She left the house in a panic, her hands shaking, her mind racing. She needed a story, something that would make sense. She broke a window, scattered a few drawers, made it look like a robbery gone wrong. When the police arrived, she was already sobbing, telling them about the masked intruder who had forced his way inside. A stranger, a thief, a killer. But lies unravel fast. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of another person. The blood on her clothes, the inconsistencies in her statement. It didn't take long before the truth came crashing down. She was arrested within days. At her trial, she tried to justify it, tried to explain the years of neglect, of favoritism, of being treated like nothing. But no one cared about her excuses. The jury saw one thing: a sister who had murdered her own blood over money. Convicted in 2002, Natalie spent the next 4 years on death row, refusing to engage with other inmates, spending most of her days in silence. For her last meal, she asked for something simple: pasta and lemonade. As she lay on the execution table in 2006, she whispered one final regret: "I should have handled things differently." But regrets don't change outcomes. The poison entered her veins, and within minutes, the weight of decades of bitterness disappeared forever. Karen Monroe, State of Louisiana, 1,985. People in town always thought Karen Monroe was a little off. She was religious, too religious. The kind of woman who saw signs in everything, who whispered prayers under her breath even in casual conversation. She never let her daughter Abigail play with other kids, convinced they would corrupt her. And when Abigail started throwing tantrums like any 6-year-old would, Karen became convinced something dark had taken hold of her. It got worse over time. She fasted for days, refused to let doctors near her daughter, and began to hear voices she believed were divine warnings. Then, one night, she decided she had to save Abigail's soul. She ran a bath, humming a hymn as she filled it. She held Abigail close, whispering that soon she would be free. When the girl struggled, Karen only tightened her grip, convinced she was doing the right thing. When it was over, she stayed by the tub for hours, praying over the still water. The police found her like that. She didn't resist, didn't cry, she just smiled and told them she's safe now. At trial, doctors said she was insane. The jury didn't care. To them, she was a monster. She was sentenced to death in 1986. Karen barely spoke on death row. She spent her days writing Bible verses on the walls of her cell, preparing for what she believed would be her reunion with God. When the time came in 1993, she refused a last meal, saying she was already purified. Her last words? "I'm ready." Valerie Nichols, State of Georgia, 1994. Valerie Nichols had everything: money, luxury, the kind of life people dream about. But it wasn't enough. She married Charles Nichols for his fortune, thinking she could spend freely without consequence. But Charles wasn't a fool. When he cut her off, refused to pay her gambling debts, and threatened to leave her with nothing, Valerie panicked. Then she saw the solution: his life insurance policy. She found someone willing to do the job, a man who needed cash more than he cared about morals. 50 grand. That's all it took. One night, as Charles left his office, a masked figure stepped out of the shadows. A struggle, a gunshot. And just like that, Valerie was a rich widow. She played her role well. Grieving wife, tearful public statements, a grand funeral. But the hitman had his own problems. When he got arrested for something unrelated, he made a deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he gave Valerie up. It took one trial to seal her fate. No one believed her crocodile tears. She was sentenced to death in 1995. On death row, she refused to acknowledge her guilt. She spent her last years complaining about prison food, the heat, the lack of silk sheets. She was still pretending she belonged to a different world. Her final meal request? Hot chocolate and croissants. One last taste of wealth before she was gone. She left a letter behind, just a single sentence. I regret nothing. In 2000, the world moved on. Valerie Nichols did not. Teresa Holloway, State of Arizona, 2000. Teresa Holloway was used to walking on eggshells. Every word she spoke, every move she made, it was all carefully calculated to avoid setting Michael off. He had a temper that could flip in an instant, a smile turning to rage before she could brace herself. At first, it was just words. Then, the control tightened. He monitored her phone calls, questioned her every outing, dictated what she wore. The first slap came when she laughed too loud at a party, the second when she looked at a waiter for too long. After that, it became routine. She tried to leave, more than once, but Michael always found her, always reeled her back in with apologies and promises that never lasted. The police were no help. He hasn't done anything serious, they told her. Call us if it gets worse. It got worse. One night, after a fight that left her with bruises on her ribs, Teresa lay awake listening to Michael snore beside her. The thought crept into her mind like a whisper. She could end it. She reached for the gun he kept in the nightstand, the same gun he had once pointed at her as a warning, 2 shots to the chest. He barely had time to open his eyes. She called the police herself, still shaking. She told them everything, about the years of torment, about the fear that had become her whole life. But the prosecution saw it differently. They pointed to the way she had waited for him to sleep, how she could have left the house instead, how she had gone straight for the gun without hesitation, premeditated murder. The jury didn't care that she had been a victim for years. They saw only the crime, not the cause. Teresa was sentenced to death in 2000. On death row, she became an advocate for women in abusive relationships. She wrote letters, warning them not to let things get as bad as they had for her. She urged them to run before it was too late. Her last meal was simple, a cheeseburger, fries, and a milkshake. Before the execution in 2005, she whispered, "I had no way out." Some believe she meant the crime. Others thought she was talking about the life that had led her there. Monica Reid, State of Missouri, 2001. Monica Reid had spent most of her life getting away with things. She knew how to talk her way out of trouble, how to make people trust her, how to spin a story so well that even she started believing it. She had a knack for finding the weak spots in people, the lonely, the elderly, the desperate. With just the right words, she could convince them to hand over their savings, to sign away their homes, to write checks they couldn't afford. And she never looked back. But then she met Eleanor Price. Eleanor wasn't like Monica's other victims. She was sharp, suspicious. She had money, but she wasn't gullible. When Eleanor caught on to the scam, she didn't stay silent. She threatened legal action. She told Monica she was going to the police, and that was a problem. Monica didn't panic. She planned. She waited until Eleanor was alone in her house, then let herself in with the spare key she had stolen weeks earlier. The struggle didn't last long. Monica was younger, stronger. She pressed her hands around Eleanor's throat until she stopped fighting. She staged the scene to look like a break-in, smashed a window, tipped over some furniture, but she was sloppy. The police found her fingerprints on the glass, her DNA under Eleanor's nails. And when they dug into her past, they uncovered a trail of fraud that led straight to this moment. She tried to lie her way out of it. She claimed she had been framed, that someone was setting her up, but the evidence was too strong. In 2001, Monica Reid was sentenced to death. On death row, she never stopped protesting her innocence. She refused interviews, refused to admit what she had done. To the very end, she insisted she was a victim of circumstance, not a murderer. For her last meal, she chose lobster with asparagus and a glass of iced tea. It was a meal fit for high society, for the life she had always pretended to belong to. As the execution drugs took effect in 2006, she left behind a final statement. "I was never guilty." No one believed her. Cassandra Myers, State of North Carolina, 1999. Cassandra Myers never imagined herself as a criminal. She was a mother first, a tired, overworked, underpaid woman just trying to keep food on the table. The bills piled up faster than she could pay them, the threats of eviction became louder, and her children's empty plates haunted her. Then she met Anthony Carter. He was smooth, confident, a man who seemed to have all the answers. He told her he could fix her problems, that she deserved more, that she just needed to be willing to take a little risk. At first, it was small things. Running errands, holding on to cash for him. Then, one night, he made her an offer. "One job, one store. You hold the gun, I'll do the rest. You'll never have to worry about money again." Cassandra hesitated, but desperation speaks louder than reason. The plan was simple. Walk into a convenience store, get the cash, and get out. No one was supposed to get hurt. But when the clerk, an older man with shaking hands, refused to cooperate, Anthony yelled for her to do something. The gun was already in her hand. She pulled the trigger before she had time to think. The man collapsed behind the counter. Blood spread across the linoleum floor. Cassandra dropped the gun and ran. She barely made it a mile before the police caught her. Anthony disappeared, but Cassandra had no such luck. She was arrested, charged with first-degree murder, and convicted within months. Her public defender argued that she had been manipulated, that she was acting under duress, but the jury didn't buy it. She had fired the gun. That was all they needed to know. In prison, Cassandra turned to faith. She spent her days in prayer, reading scripture, searching for forgiveness she would never find. Her last meal was pasta with marinara sauce and garlic bread. Something simple, something warm, something that reminded her of home. Before the execution in 2004, she wept. "If I could take it back, I would." But time didn't move backward. The lethal injection was quick. The regret lasted much longer. Rachel Donovan, State of Tennessee, 2003. Rachel Donovan had been a teacher for 8 years. Well-respected, trusted, admired. Parents saw her as the kind of woman who looked out for their children. But no one knew about the affair. She told herself it wasn't wrong, that love was unpredictable, that emotions were messy. She told herself a lot of things. The truth was, she had fallen in love with the father of one of her students. Daniel Davis was charming, attentive, everything she had wanted. Their secret relationship stretched over months until his wife, Emily, found out. Emily confronted Rachel one evening, showing up unannounced at her home. Words turned into shouting, shouting turned into pushing, and then Rachel grabbed the first heavy object she could find, a fireplace poker. She swung it once, then again. Emily fell. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel stood over the body, her pulse hammering in her ears. She knew she had minutes before Daniel would start looking for his wife. She needed to erase the evidence. She set fire to the house, hoping to burn away her crime, but arson is a messy cover-up. Investigators found inconsistencies in her alibi, and DNA evidence placed her at the scene. Within days, she was arrested, and within months, she was convicted. On death row, she refused interviews. She stopped writing letters. She didn't want to explain herself. Maybe because there was no excuse. Her last meal was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with a glass of milk. Before the execution in 2008, she whispered, "I lost myself in love, and I destroyed a family." A second later, she was gone. Angela Cooper, State of Nevada, 1997. Angela Cooper had always been a master manipulator, using her charm to get what she wanted. Throughout her life, she drifted from one relationship to another, always seeking financial security. Her downfall came when she convinced her teenage son to assist in the murder of her wealthy husband, Gregory Cooper. She wanted full control of his estate and saw no other way to get it but through bloodshed. Angela meticulously planned the crime, ensuring that all loose ends were tied up. She coached her son on what to say if they were caught and carefully laid out an alibi. On the night of the murder, Gregory was ambushed in his home. A brutal struggle ensued, and though he fought back, he was ultimately overpowered. His body was left in the bedroom, staged to look like a botched robbery. At first, the police believed the story. However, a neighbor's surveillance camera caught Angela's son disposing of the murder weapon. When confronted, the boy broke down and confessed, implicating his mother. The court was merciless in its judgment. Angela was convicted in 1997, while her son received a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony against her. Angela remained unrepentant on death row, showing no remorse for her actions. She was often described as cold and calculating, even as her execution date approached. Her final meal request included steak, a baked potato, and chocolate cake. As she lay strapped to the execution table in 2002, she refused to make a final statement, turning her head away from the witnesses as the lethal injection was administered. Jessica Monroe, State of Ohio, 2004. Jessica Monroe was drowning in debt, suffocating under a mountain of unpaid bills and overdue notices. Every phone call became a reminder of her failures. Creditors demanding money she didn't have, threats of legal action, eviction warnings. She had tried everything: loans, side jobs, even borrowing from friends. But nothing was enough. The weight of it all bore down on her until it felt like she had no escape. Then she thought of Laura. Her older sister had always been the responsible one, the one who made smart choices. Laura had a stable career, a perfect house, and, most importantly, a $500,000 life insurance policy. It was meant to protect her future, to provide security for those she loved. But Jessica didn't see it that way. To her, it was a lifeline, the answer to all her problems. She started planning months in advance, researching methods that wouldn't leave evidence: sedatives, suffocation techniques, ways to stage a convincing suicide. She read case studies, forensic reports, anything that could help her get away with it. And when the time came, she put her plan into motion. She invited Laura over for dinner, playing the role of the loving sister, pretending she wanted to mend the distance between them. They laughed, reminisced about childhood, toasted to better days. And as Laura sipped her wine, Jessica watched her carefully, waiting for the moment when the sedatives would take effect. Laura's eyelids grew heavy. Her words slurred. Jessica guided her to the couch, whispering soft reassurances as her sister's body grew limp. Then, with a calmness that frightened even herself, she placed a pillow over Laura's face and pressed down. It was quick. There was no struggle, just silence. Afterward, she arranged the scene, placing an empty pill bottle beside Laura, adjusting her body to make it look natural. She had thought of everything. It was the perfect crime. But the cracks appeared faster than she expected. The toxicology report showed an unusual dose of a sedative that Laura had never been prescribed. Investigators searched Jessica's computer and found damning evidence: internet searches on staged suicides, insurance fraud, and lethal drug combinations. She had sealed her own fate before the police had even knocked on her door. At trial, Jessica broke down, claiming desperation had driven her to do the unthinkable. But the jury had no sympathy for greed. She was convicted in 2004 and sentenced to death. On death row, she rarely spoke to anyone, spending most of her time writing letters to no one in particular. Letters filled with apologies, regret, and words she should have told Laura when she was alive. For her last meal, she requested fried shrimp, coleslaw, and a glass of lemonade. Witnesses said she looked genuinely remorseful as she lay on the gurney, whispering one final confession before the executioner's switch was flipped. "I let greed consume me, and now I have nothing." But for Laura's family, her remorse meant nothing. It was far too late for regrets. Caroline Benson, State of Tennessee, 2003. Caroline Benson's love story was built on destruction. She met Daniel Rogers when she was barely out of her teens, a time when passion outweighed reason, when red flags looked more like challenges to be conquered. Their relationship was a storm, volatile, reckless, consuming. The fights were brutal, the reconciliations passionate. She told herself it was normal, that love was supposed to be messy, that she could fix him, fix them. Her friends warned her, "Leave, get out before it's too late." But she didn't. Then came the night that changed everything. The argument started over nothing, a missed call, a misunderstood tone, something insignificant. But it escalated quickly, spiraling into the kind of fight where words weren't enough. This time, when Daniel raised his hand, she didn't back down. She saw red. The knife was within reach. One moment it was sitting on the kitchen counter. The next, it was in her hands, buried deep in his chest. The first wound should have been enough, but she kept going, again and again, until his body slumped to the floor and the only sound in the room was her own ragged breathing. She called 911 immediately, sobbing, insisting she had acted in self-defense. But when investigators arrived, the evidence told a different story. There were no defensive wounds on her body, no bruises, nothing to suggest she had been in immediate danger. And the stab wounds, they weren't the kind inflicted by someone fighting for their life. They were the kind driven by rage, by fury, by years of resentment exploding all at once. The trial was swift. The jury saw through her lies, concluding that her actions weren't about survival, they were about revenge. Convicted in 2003, Caroline spent 5 years on death row. She maintained that she had acted out of fear, not malice. But in the end, fear doesn't stab a man 20 times. Her last meal was a tuna sandwich with apple pie. Before the lethal injection took hold in 2008, she whispered her final words. "I didn't want this to happen, but it had happened. And there was no taking it back." These 15 women walked the thin line between desperation and destruction. Their crimes were committed in moments of passion, greed, fear, or calculated malice. Some sought revenge, others sought freedom, and some believed they had no way out. Yet the law saw their actions for what they were, acts that warranted the ultimate punishment. For some, remorse came too late. For others, it never came at all. Their names now belong to history, their stories forever linked to the dark corridors of justice. Their final meals, last words, and the moments leading to their deaths serve as reminders of the thin line between justice and vengeance. The execution chamber remains silent, but the stories of those who perished within its walls continue to haunt the pages of history.